welcome back. I am Mr. Sosatris. It is Monday and it is time for another video. This week I wanted to do a video on analyzing literature. And I know that sounds kind of stuffy, but let's bear with me here. This is going to be fun, I promise. Okay, you may ask, why can't we just read a book and just enjoy it, and when we get to the end of the book, we close it, and then we move on like a normal human being? The answer is you can absolutely do that. There's nothing wrong with that. The fun in analyzing something and digging into it a little bit more is just basically if you're a nerd like me and you want to kind of explore it a little more. But it also kind of encourages critical thinking skills, which I think are really important nowadays because there's a lack of critical thinking in the world. And it's kind of unfortunate. But analyzing literature is not just about like the stuffy academics sitting in a library all by themselves, far away from the cares of the world. That sounds great. Now, the reason why teachers make students analyze literature is not to torture them. I know you may think that that is the truth, but it's not. It's to encourage critical thinking and creative thinking and making connections between different things and kind of finding something in a text that isn't explicit and being able to like zip through those like connections of neurons and like find a connection that's startling and really cool. And I'm going to focus on three particular branches of it rather than like doing a full overview on like the history of literary analysis and critical theory, because that's a lot and I don't want to do that. So the first one I wanted to look at is a branch of critical theory called New Historicism. And this is a really interesting one because it takes a look at a text in terms of its context in history. To a new historicist, literature is not the record of a single mind, but the end product of a particular cultural moment. New historicists look at literature alongside other cultural products of a particular historical period to illustrate how concepts, attitudes, and ideologies operated across a broader cultural spectrum that is not exclusively literary. So, okay, for an example, you can look at The Great Gatsby. This one's read quite a bit, and I know a lot of stuff is made about like the symbolism of like Daisy's green light and all that stuff. But if you were to approach this from like a new historicist perspective, you would maybe ask yourself a question like, what does this book have to say about the effects of World War I on America and like the American cultural identity, you know, that kind of thing? What ripple effects from that conflict can be seen in this? Now, this is not a book about World War I. It's a book about the 20s, and it was published in 1925, so it was like in the middle of all of this. And so it was looking at the current day. It's not a historical novel, it was a contemporary novel, looking at like the thing right now where we are. And so it's not about World War I, but because World War I, when this was written, was about 7 years before, that's still pretty recent. And so the ripple effects of that could be seen in this. So if you were taking a new historicist perspective of this, you'd be looking at kind of what does this book say about the effects of World War I. You would look at like times where anyone mentioned the war and see what kind of significance those mentions would have. You would also look at kind of the context. You would look at the writer, what was Fitzgerald's relationship with World War I. What was he doing at that time? How did it relate to him? Did it affect him and his family personally? What kinds of things would he have taken from his own life into this? Now, I know in a previous video I talked about death of the author, and that is something that you need to be aware of when doing any kind of literary criticism. But in something like New Historicism, you do want to think about how the events of the author's life may have affected this. Now, you're not going to be saying, this is what the author meant, or this is what the author obviously intended, but you are going to say kind of what did um, the events surrounding the author's writing of this, how did that influence the writing of this? Because everyone is influenced by everything in history. And you can see that a lot in a lot of things written after September 11th, 2001. You know, kind of the post 9/11 world that really affected the cultural landscape, and there was a lot of books that were written that really reflected kind of the shift and change that sort of brought about. So you know, even if it's not specifically about something, you do need to be aware that books can be products of their historical context, and that's what the new historicism approach is focusing on. And so that's one way to look at the Great Gatsby. So if you were reading this, you would want to answer the question, you know, what does this book say about the effects of World War I on America? And then your answer of that, you know, to that question would sort of be the thesis of your analysis. Now that's just kind of, I just pulled that one out of the air. There's lots more nuanced, complex ways to analyze this. It's a short book, but it's a really deep, complex one, and it's a really important one. And I think there's a lot of depth in there and a lot of things that you can kind of dig into. The next branch of literary theory that I wanted to discuss is post-colonialism. And this is a really, really cool one. Post-colonial criticism offers a fundamental critique of the ideology of colonial domination, and at the same time seeks to undo the imaginative geography of Orientalist thought that produced conceptual as well as economic divides between West and East, civilized and uncivilized, first and third worlds. So post-colonialism is basically, it centers the voices of the colonized, and because a lot of narratives, even if they're focusing on the plight of kind of colonized peoples, is often told from the perspective of kind of the privilege of the colonizer. A good example of this is Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It's written by a white woman, and like her intentions are good. She's writing about the plight of enslaved people in the United States, but it's about that plight. A post-colonialist would say it's probably better to read something like, you know, Frederick Douglass's slave narrative, because like you want to focus on his voice, because he actually lived the experience. You know, he's not someone who's writing about the experience. And so post-colonialism is all about kind of deconstructing like structures of power and focusing on things from the point of view of the people who are colonized. So a good example of this is Chinua Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart. Now this is a book where kind of the arrival of the white missionaries destabilizes the book itself, because the book is a story of a man who's trying to kind of live beyond the humiliations of kind of his father's failure, and he's trying to kind of create something new. And so he overcompensates by becoming quite a tyrannical person, and he alienates a lot of his family, and you know, it's all about this struggle of this one person who's trying so hard to not be his father that he becomes kind of a monstrous person in his own right. And it's kind of his journey, his character arc, as he's trying to figure out, you know, how he fits into the kind of the world around him. And then about 2/3 of the way through the book, the white missionaries show up and they build a church and they try to change things and convert people, and the narrative kind of falls apart. The main arc of the plot is sort of cut off. You know, you've got this character arc, and it sort of hits a brick wall, and the story sort of, I wouldn't say fizzles out, because that makes it seem like it's not a good ending, but the ending sort of, it meanders away from the plot that we were invested in, because this is a great human drama about, you know, it's got a very psychological core to it, about trying to escape the past. And then when this new element comes in, the book itself kind of crumbles a bit. This is very much considered like a post-colonial text. Another thing you can do with post-colonialism is you can analyze texts that aren't necessarily about colonialism. A good example of this would be Shakespeare's play The Tempest, because the events that lead up to the action of the play is you've got this witch named Sycorax, who is from Algiers, and she's banished for practicing sorcery. And so, and also at the time she's pregnant with sort of a half-human child, and she's banished from Algiers, and she's exiled to this island where she lives kind of with her son once he's born, and she sort of controls the island. She kind of takes command of the spirits that live there, because like she's a witch, and so she has magic, and so she kind of becomes the kind of ruler of this island. And then eventually she dies of old age, and Caliban is left on his own. Caliban's her son. And so then we have Prospero, who's the Duke of Milan, and he comes to this island and sort of takes over. He sort of claims the island as his own. He frees the spirit Ariel from a tree where they were trapped, and he kind of enslaves Caliban as a servant. You know, when we see him like carrying sticks and things. And so in the play, Caliban was sort of a reminder of kind of the wildness of the island that Prospero tamed. And I think at the end of the play, Caliban sort of realizes that, you know, Prospero is the one who should be in charge, and he kind of defers to him. It's not great. But then we've also got Sycorax, who's kind of this counterpart to Prospero. You know, she's the evil magic user, and he's the good magic user. And, you know, they're kind of in conflict before the play starts, and she eventually dies. And Prospero has to kind of undo the things that Sycorax did. And so when it was performed, which was like early 17th century, Caliban was very much like a comedic character. He was kind of goofy and strange and complaining about everything, but he was kind of odd, and he was there to be kind of just a bit of exotica, along with kind of Ariel, who's also sort of in the service of Prospero and is sort of enslaved by him. And so if you were to look at The Tempest from a post-colonial perspective, there's a lot more depth to there, and there's a lot more stuff that's interesting. It makes things a little murkier, and it makes Prospero less of a hero, and you get to see kind of, you know, Sycorax as like a refugee exiled from an oppressive state kind of thing. And also she is able to kind of, you know, she has her island to herself where she's kind of in control of it. And then you've got this white European who comes along and sort of takes the island from her. You've got the threat of like Caliban at one point, he does attack and assault Miranda. He tries to, and he makes a comment about how he wants to people the whole island with Calibans. And so you've got, again, this kind of this fear of like the, you know, quote unquote replacement theory, where you know, indigenous people or non-white people are going to like take over, and through interbreeding are going to kind of overpower kind of the white people. And it's just, there's a whole lot of stuff there, and I don't think Shakespeare intended any of that, but you can see he was kind of playing to the fear. It's like, what if this weirdo, you know, was able to populate the island and take over? Wouldn't that be funny? If, you know, this, you know, he thinks he can rule an island, but he's not even a white person, so how does he do that? That's probably more what Shakespeare was thinking. But when you look at it from a post-colonial perspective, Caliban and Ariel, to an extent, also become like indigenous peoples. And even though they migrated there beforehand, they were there first. And then you've got this white European who comes along and takes over. And so there's a lot of depth there, and Caliban becomes much more interesting. He's one of those characters where, kind of like in The Merchant of Venice, the character of Shylock, he's kind of like that, where you've got a character who was originally kind of a little bit more two-dimensional and kind of funny, and you're supposed to laugh at them, but there's enough depth there that you can interpret the character in more meaningful, sensitive ways and find cool threads that you wouldn't normally find. And so Caliban is a perfect example of that. You want to kind of learn more about him. He's kind of one of the more interesting people in the play. And so you want to kind of explore that a little bit more. And I would love to see, and I think it probably exists, but I'd love to see like a story from his perspective, you know, where he's not kind of this groveling, strange, slave-like character, which is kind of gross, but is more kind of someone who's trying to stand up against these people who have so much more power than he does, and he isn't able to kind of keep control of his own island. The Julie Taymor version, which I really like, I know a lot of people thought it was kind of weird. There's the gender-swapped Prospero, and it's kind of over the top and everything. I like Julie Taymor, sue me. But I really liked Jumon Hansu's portrayal of him, because he gave Caliban a lot more depth. Now, there is kind of the structure of the play itself and the dialogue of the play itself, so you're kind of limited in what you can do. But the actor really did give a lot of nuance to this character, and he made him more of a human, complex person rather than just like stage, decoration, kind of thing. He's not just a funny clown. He's actually like a meaningful character who's a part of this whole thing. So that's post-colonialism, and it's awesome. And I'd love to do a whole video on just that someday. We'll see. And the final one I want to highlight is queer theory. And this is another one that's really interesting. It's a broad interdisciplinary field, so it's not like one specific thing, but it's a really interesting way to engage with text. Queer theory is an interdisciplinary field that encourages one to look at the world through new avenues. It is a way of thinking that dismantles traditional assumptions about gender and sexual identities, challenges traditional academic approaches, and fights against social inequality. So essentially, queer theory is a way to filter a text through the 2S LGBTQ+ kind of experience, and to see which characters kind of get caught in that net, and then dig into kind of that. It's a way to find different meaning in a text, and to sort of seek out different kinds of depth in a character's experience that you might not be able to find initially. So a good example of this is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. So the main character, Victor Frankenstein, has his best friend in the whole world, Henry Clerval, and their relationship is given quite a bit of depth. They don't appear in very many scenes together. He's more at the beginning, but like, they're interesting characters, and they care about each other, and there's real kind of meaning there, and it's kind of trendy, I guess, between a lot of scholars to read the two as being in a queer relationship of some kind, because when you look at Victor's kind of heterosexual relationship with Elizabeth Lavenza, she's kind of more an object. She's like a goal, and she's a little more ephemeral, and she just kind of exists as something that he's like, oh, eventually I'm going to marry her. But we don't see a lot of like conversations between the two of them. We don't see a lot of like meaningful interactions. It's very much kind of like the really classic like Snow White kind of thing, where it's like they don't really meet, but they want to end up together. And of course, the monster kills her, and it's tragic, and Victor is kind of really broken up about it. But the way that it's written is Victor and Henry's relationship is given a lot more depth and detail than his relationship with Elizabeth. And so one way you can read this is that she represents kind of the conventional heterosexual goal that was expected of men at that time, and he's just kind of going through the motions to be like, okay, I'm going to end up with her because she's a good match, and I know her really well, because she's like in one version, like the first edition, I think, she was like adopted by his family, so she's kind of his adopted sister, and he calls it like his more than sister, which we won't get into that. I think in the 1830 edition, she's like adopted when her family dies, and she's kind of found and then, you know, adopted by someone else, and so they're not related. But anyways, the relationship between Victor and Elizabeth is just, there's not a lot there, and so you can read it as sort of like he's doing this because he feels he needs to, and he feels that it's a good match, but there's no meaningful connection there. But you do see a meaningful connection between him and Henry, because they actually talk and they support each other, and they have like an actual relationship. Now, it's a friendship in the book, but you can read it that way. It's a way to kind of find a new way of reading it that allows you to connect with it more, and to connect the book with sort of the present day, and to find new relevance for modern audiences. So it kind of, it's a way to keep books relevant and keep them evolving and growing, because if a book is really good, it will sort of remain relevant to society as it evolves over time. Now, I should state that queer theory is not just shipping characters together. It's not just like finding two characters and being like, ooh, what if they were in a relationship because they have a connection. It's not that. It's a way to find meaning in a text that can relate to the queer experience. And so it's more about like asking yourself, what does this book, like what can this book tell us about the struggles that queer people face? Or what can this book tell us about the complexities of gender identity? If a character is well written enough, then you will have characters who sometimes don't relate to their gender identity in a conventional way, and so there's ways to kind of find new meaning and depth in there, and recontextualize characters in other ways. So that is queer theory, and that's a really rough, like, bull in a china shop explanation of it, but it's a really cool way to engage with things. And so there's lots of other branches of literary theory. I just focused on 3, but there's a ton. There's a lot. There's like the structuralists, and there's the new, like the post-structuralists. There's the Marxists who look at sort of class struggle as it relates to a book. That one's really cool as well. There's feminist theory, which looks at how women are portrayed. There's gender studies, which looks at, exactly what you'd think, gender relationships and all that. You can do critical race theory, where you look at sort of the structures of white supremacy and how they interact with characters of color and all of that. There's also like reader response approaches, where you just focus on kind of your relationship with the text one-on-one. You don't think about anything else, no outside context. It's literally just you and the book, and what things leap out to you specifically and how they connect with you. So that's really cool. But I should also say, critical theory isn't just relegated to like studying classics, like removed from the modern age kind of thing. You can use it all the time. For example, you can ask yourself, what does Yellowface by R.F. Kuang have to say about white supremacy? Because there's a lot in here about white supremacy. You can also ask yourself, what does The Calculating Stars have to say about feminism? And how women engage with structures of power, and how they're able to kind of, what little power they're able to have influence with those around them in a workplace that's kind of stacked against them. You can also do something like, what does Kaikei say about like the asexual experience? Because the main character can be coded as ace. And I think she was written to be ace. It's pretty explicit in a few places, but even if it's not, there's still a lot of really interesting depth in here. It's like how does this kind of person relate to relationships and expectations, and how do they navigate all that? So there's a lot of really cool things you can do with this that relate to sort of the modern day, and it's not just a stuffy, do this because you have to like overanalyze a text and find something that isn't there. And when you find a certain approach that really connects with a text, like you're able to find something really cool, it's like puzzle pieces fitting together. It's this really cool moment where you're like, actually, that does fit. You know, the author probably didn't intend that, but it really works well. And so that's the exciting part of it. And so it's more about just read critically, engage with things, and you don't have to analyze everything. If you want to read something and just enjoy it as a book and just enjoy it as a story and just turn your brain off, that's totally fine. I'm not saying this is something you have to do, but I'm saying it's something that is fun to do if you find a book that you really want to get into. And it's interesting because one way that people engage with texts is like fan fiction or tabbing or annotating a book. You know, all of that, that's all still forms of critically analyzing a text. Even if it's just a fun, you know, underline all the things that you love, that's still like a form of reader response, because you're saying, you know, what quotes leapt out at you, what quotes do you think are really profound, what quotes made you think, and it's all that kind of stuff. And like when you're writing fan fiction, you're kind of connecting dots that may not necessarily be there, or you're fixing plot holes by finding new potential in the story, or you're finding relationships that are actually really compelling that may not have been given a lot of attention. And so there's lots of different ways to do this. It's not just about like write an essay and then submit it. There's lots of cool ways that you can analyze something and engage with it and have fun with the text, and that's why I love it. So on that note, I will let you go. I will see you next week. Happy reading, and you have a good week. Bye.